The restaurant inhaled when he entered. Conversations thinned to threads, spoons hovered mid-air, and the light at the window seemed to cool by a single, precise degree. K.L. Vaynor didn't stride so much as rearrange the room by existing in it. Tailored coat, winter blue gaze, the quiet gravity of someone accustomed to doors parting and people yielding. But not everyone yielded. Vivian Arlo stepped from the service station with a tray balanced on one hand and a steadiness balanced on the other. Her apron was pressed, her hair tucked behind one ear, her expression clear and unhurried. She crossed the floor as if the air belonged to her too, past the brass sconces, past the polished wood, past the small corner table where her son, Orion, sketched skylines and waited with the patient confidence of a boy who trusted his mother's rhythm. At the window, Kyle sat without looking up. The chair accepted him like an order taken. Around them, staff exchanged quick glances, the kind that asked, "Who's going to handle him?" Celine half raised a hand ready to trade sections, but Vivian gave the smallest nod. "I've got this." She arrived at the table, set a glass of water down exactly where he would reach for it, lemon sliced bright as a coin in clear light. "Good evening, Mr. Vaynor," she said. No tremor, no flirt, no performance. Just a voice calibrated to professional warmth and personal spine. He lifted his gaze. The air tightened, then held. Up close, his reputation looked like restraint, edges honed to keep the world a step away. "You're new," he said. "Not really," she replied. "Just not afraid." A heartbeat of surprise passed through his eyes, there and gone. A fork clinked at a table across the room, the sound small but certain. Vivian didn't fill the silence. She let it prove she wasn't rushed, wasn't rattled. She placed a folded napkin, once, not twice, and a small dish of cracked pepper, details that said, "I see you," without surrendering an inch. A corner of his mouth almost moved. "We'll see." Vivian held his gaze, steady as a level line. Around them, the room remembered how to breathe. And for the first time in this place, the storm met a shoreline that didn't erode. "Tell me, have you ever stood in front of someone who carried a presence so heavy it bent the air? Maybe it was a boss whose silence was louder than their words. Maybe it was a family member who always demanded the final say. Maybe it was someone in your life who wore confidence like armor, and without meaning to, you found yourself shrinking in their shadow. We've all seen that kind of person, the one whose footsteps make conversations stumble, whose gaze makes even capable people doubt themselves. Most of us adjust, play it safe, bow our heads, or keep our distance, because challenging power, whether in a boardroom, a classroom, or a dinner table, feels dangerous. But here's the question: what happens when someone doesn't shrink? What happens when an ordinary person, carrying no wealth or status, refuses to hand over their peace? What happens when calm dignity answers arrogance, not with rebellion or aggression, but with unwavering steadiness? That's where this story begins. And that's why, in the middle of a restaurant full of whispers, one woman decided she would not let someone else's storm dictate the weather inside her soul. Vivian Arlo, single mother, waitress, survivor of longer nights than anyone in that room could imagine, chose to meet Kyle Vaynor's cold reputation with something stronger, quiet courage. And in doing so, she revealed a truth many of us forget. Sometimes the smallest act of not flinching can shift the entire balance of power. Here's the problem. Too often, we hand our power away without realizing it. We let arrogance decide the tone of the room. We let money dictate who gets to speak and who stays silent. We let someone else's temper become the weather, while we stand in the storm without an umbrella. That's what everyone in the restaurant did that night. They lowered their eyes, hushed their voices, and surrendered their peace before K.L. Vaynor even spoke a word. His reputation wasn't just about wealth or sharp business moves. It was about fear. Fear that he might notice you. Fear that he might judge you. Fear that his presence was a test you couldn't pass. And fear like that doesn't just exist in restaurants. It's in offices where employees walk on eggshells. It's in homes where one person's anger decides whether dinner is peaceful or tense. It's in friendships where silence feels safer than honesty. The real danger isn't the arrogant billionaire. The real danger is what happens when ordinary people believe they have no choice but to submit. That night, Kyle's power wasn't the problem. The problem was how easily everyone gave it to him. Everyone, except Vivian. She showed us what happens when one person refuses to be ruled by someone else's storm. She showed us that dignity, even whispered, can speak louder than fear shouted. And that's a problem worth solving. How do we stop giving away the ground we're standing on? So here's the question. What changes when someone finally refuses to play by fear's rules? What happens when a single mother, with no fortune to her name, no headlines to shield her, stands eye to eye with the man everyone else bows to? Not with anger, not with defiance for show, but with a calm so steady it unsettles him more than hostility ever could. That's the heart of this story. Because Kyle Vayner, this man the city whispered about, this storm in a tailored suit, had never met someone like Vivian Arlo. And when he did, something shifted. Slowly, then suddenly, the unshakable billionaire began to realize that control was not the same as respect, and that the strongest person in the room wasn't always the one with the power, but sometimes the one with the courage to stay gentle. This tale isn't about wealth against poverty or arrogance against humility. It's about choice, the choice to hold your peace when it would be easier to surrender it. The choice to protect your dignity even when the world tells you it doesn't matter. And before we're through, you'll see how a mother's steady resolve didn't just soften the edges of a feared billionaire, it rewrote his story entirely. But before we dive into the details, let me welcome you properly. Welcome, my friends, to Tales by Williams, where every story isn't just told for entertainment, but to plant a seed of courage, of kindness, of lessons we can carry into our own lives. If you've ever felt small in the face of someone else's power, if you've ever wished you could stand your ground without shouting, without losing yourself, then this is the place for you. Because here, we believe stories can be more than escape. They can be teachers, reminders, companions on the road we're all walking. So if you're new, thank you for stopping by. And if you've been here before, welcome back. I'm glad you're here for another journey. Before we go further, do me one favor. Hit that subscribe button right now and make sure to turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss a story crafted to inspire, to challenge, and to encourage you. And if this story resonates with you along the way, don't just keep it to yourself. Like, share, and comment. The more these lessons spread, the more light we scatter in a world that needs it. Now let's step into the heart of tonight's tale. Because the table by the window, the one where Vivian and Kyle first met, is waiting, and the story it holds will stay with you long after the last word. Picture it clearly. The restaurant was alive with its usual rhythm, forks chiming against plates, low conversations stitched together by the scent of rosemary bread, and warm light spilling across polished wood. It wasn't grand, but it was human, a place where tired workers came to feel seen, where laughter sometimes rose above the clatter of dishes. And then the door opened. Kyle Vayner walked in. Heads turned, then dipped. The laughter clipped itself short. The warmth in the air pulled back, as though the very walls knew to hold their breath. His presence arrived before his voice, before his gaze, before he even chose a seat. By the window, where the city lights climbed the glass like constellations, he settled into his usual table. And just like that, the entire dining room bent around him. But across the floor, Vivian Arlo smoothed her apron, tucked a curl behind her ear, and glanced toward the corner table where her son Orion sat sketching. He gave her a small thumbs up, his way of saying, "You've got this, Mom," and she did, because while the rest of the room braced itself against the storm, Vivian walked straight toward it, not to fight, not to flatter, but to prove something we often forget. Dignity, when carried with calm certainty, can hold its ground against any arrogance. And that, my friends, is where our story truly begins. The restaurant was not the grandest in the city, but it had its own quiet dignity. Brass sconces shed a golden glow across the walls, their light catching on polished wood that had been buffed so often it seemed to hum with care. A steady rhythm of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, and the fragrance of rosemary bread made the space feel safe, almost like a refuge for those who stepped in from the restless streets outside. Families gathered here after long days, couples leaned toward each other over steaming bowls, and tired workers found comfort in the steady warmth. It was a place built not on glamour, but on intention. Every detail, from the soft lamplight to the fresh bread, was designed to remind people that belonging mattered. And then the door opened. Cale Vaynor entered, and the atmosphere shifted. The glow didn't vanish, but it faltered, like a fire struggling against a sudden gust of cold wind. Conversations stilled, forks hovered midair, and every pair of eyes flickered toward the man whose reputation reached the room before he did. His coat was dark, his stride precise, his presence so commanding it seemed to cut through the warmth. Where others brought laughter and community, he carried silence. The staff who had been smiling seconds earlier now moved with restrained care, as if even the clink of a glass might offend. His chosen seat, the table by the window, stood apart, lit by the climbing lights of the city beyond. He sat down, and the restaurant, once lively, adjusted itself around him, unwillingly but inevitably. The warmth remained, but it bent around his presence, caught between welcome and wariness. Vivian Arlo stood at the service station with a tray balanced on one palm and her breath measured to a calm count of 4. Not posed, not tense, just sure. The kind of steadiness that comes from choosing it over and over until it fits like second nature. She adjusted a loose curl behind her ear, checked the order slips, and glanced toward the corner table reserved for staff families when plans fell through. Orion sat there, hoodie bunched at the elbows, pencil scratching across a sketchbook. He drew the city as if it were a friendly giant, lines confident, windows bright. Every so often he looked up to find his mother. When he did, he offered a small thumbs up. No theatrics, just a simple signal they both understood. I'm good, you're good, we're okay. His presence settled the room for her in a way no training manual could. He was her reminder that love can be quiet and still move mountains. She had crossed harder nights than the one in front of her, and each time she'd learned to keep her balance by focusing on what mattered most. Orion was the center point she measured everything against. Celine slid in beside her, tucking a pen behind her ear with the grace of someone who'd done 10,000 refills and still cared how each one landed. He's in your section, she murmured, eyes cutting toward the window table. You want to switch? I can run it. Vivian followed the glance. Cale Vaynor was already seated, posture exact, attention somewhere far beyond the menu in his hands. The staff orbit had widened around him, busser hanging back, host pretending to reorganize a stack of menus that didn't need reorganizing. Vivian felt the room's shoulders rise, then stay there. She turned back to Celine. Thank you, she said, meaning it, but I've got him. Celine studied her friend's face, the even breath, the steady eyes. She knew enough of Vivian's story to recognize that this composure was earned. You're sure? I'm sure. Vivian's mouth curved, not quite a smile, more like a promise to herself. He's a guest. I'm a professional, that's all. Celine exhaled and bumped her shoulder lightly. All right, I'm 2 tables over if you need me. Vivian nodded, then took a beat longer to look back at Orion. He lifted the page he was working on, the restaurant front, door propped open, warm light spilling out. He'd drawn 2 stick figures, one tall, one smaller, holding an umbrella. She couldn't help it. The corners of her eyes softened. Orion grinned and returned to his sketch. Tray steady, notes memorized. Vivian stepped from the service station into the current of the dining room. The air had cooled since he arrived, but she carried her own weather, measured, fair, and unshaken. Celine watched her go with a mixture of pride and protective worry, then turned to her tables, ready to back her up if needed. Across the room, Kyle's presence pressed at the edges of the warmth. Vivian didn't push back. She simply kept her pace, bringing with her the one thing everyone else had set down: composure. She crossed the floor as if each footfall wrote its own quiet rule. I will not be hurried. I will not be rattled. I will do my work with care. The seating chart had shifted mid-shift, as it often did when the night grew thick with guests. Vivian scanned the list clipped to her station and saw it immediately. Table by the window, hers. Kyle Vayner, hers. The name didn't need an underline. Celine hovered close, still unconvinced. You know what they say about him. Staff quit after a month of his visits. One wrong word, and he'll slice you with silence sharper than a blade. It doesn't have to be you tonight. Vivian set her tray down, wiping her palms against the apron's cloth. Not in nerves, but in habit. If not me, then who? That's the point, Celine pressed. No one wants to... Vivian looked once more toward Orion. He was erasing a line with the patience of an architect, brow furrowed, lips pursed. He didn't see danger at the table by the window. He saw his mother walking steady like always. She felt that truth bolster her spine. Her decision was not bravado. It was not a challenge thrown down for drama. It was something simpler. A refusal to hand over her evening before it had even begun. Kyle Vayner might be difficult, demanding, unyielding, but that was his weight to carry, not hers. Celine studied her one last time, then gave a reluctant nod. Then take him and remind the rest of us how it's done. Vivian's lips quirked at the corner, something between resolve and encouragement. One table at a time, Cell. She picked up her tray, checked that the water glass shone, and turned toward the window. Each step forward was a line drawn. She would not let reputation dictate her poise. Her choice set the tone not just for her section, but for herself. When she reached the table, she wasn't bracing for battle. She was simply doing her work with the steadiness of someone who knew storms pass, but dignity endures. And with that choice, the first brick of the story was laid. Fear spreads quickly. That night it moved across the dining room faster than the scent of bread from the oven. Every glance at Kyle Vayner carried the same silent message. Be careful. Don't provoke him. Stay small, stay quiet, stay safe. But Vivian's decision cut against that current. She didn't march toward him with defiance, nor did she shrink back the way others did. She carried her tray as if nothing about her rhythm needed changing. Her peace was hers to keep, not his to take. That's the lesson most people miss. Storms don't choose whether or not you get wet. You choose whether or not you hand them your umbrella. Kyle's presence was fierce, yes, his reputation sharp. But neither had the authority to dictate Vivian's spirit unless she gave it to him. And she would not. By refusing to bend to fear, she reminded herself and everyone watching that calm is not weakness. It's a form of quiet power. It's saying you don't control the weather inside me. My peace is not up for negotiation. When she reached his table, that truth was already written into her posture. It was in the level tone of her voice, in the way she set down water with no wasted motion, in the simple decision not to flinch. And that was the moment Kyle noticed her, not just as another server in a long line of people intimidated by his shadow, but as someone who seemed immune to it, someone who carried her own climate, unbothered by his storm. The room had surrendered, she had not, and that made all the difference. Courage rarely entered Vivian's life with trumpets. It slipped in quietly, often disguised as ordinary decisions that no one else noticed. Like the morning she stopped taping overdue bills to the fridge and replaced them with Orion's drawings. The bills shouted fear, the drawings whispered hope. She chose to let hope speak louder in her own home. Or the evening she asked her manager for more hours without prefacing it with an apology. She had always been careful not to appear demanding, but that night she told herself, asking is not begging, work is worth pay. The request came out steady, and though her hands trembled afterward, she walked away taller. There were the nights when Orion, small and restless, asked questions that tangled with her exhaustion. Why do some people shout when they're mad? Why do others smile when they don't mean it? She wanted to wave him off, but she leaned in instead, answering as best she could. Because storms live inside people too, and sometimes they forget to close their umbrellas before stepping into someone else's sky. Each of these choices was small, yet over time they built into a pattern, the habit of not surrendering, even when surrender seemed easier. Her courage wasn't the kind that filled stadiums or led movements. It was the kind that made ends meet when the month was longer than the paycheck. The kind that looked her son in the eye and said, "We'll be okay," even when she wasn't sure how. The kind that walked to work in shoes that had seen better days and still straightened her shoulders before opening the restaurant door. So when Kyle Vayner sat in her section that night, she wasn't suddenly brave. She was simply continuing the practice she had been refining for years, meeting life's storms with a steady ground of her own. Kyle Vayner was accustomed to two kinds of responses when he entered a room: deference or discomfort. People either hurried to please him or stumbled over themselves to avoid offending him. Both were predictable, both forgettable. When Vivian approached, he expected the same. His eyes barely lifted from the menu when she set a glass of water before him. Slice of lemon angled just so, condensation sliding down the side. Her greeting was even, her voice clear. "Good evening, Mr. Vayner. Welcome back." Nothing unusual. But then came the pause. Not the nervous kind that begged for approval, but the measured kind that allowed space without apology. She didn't fidget. She didn't rush. She didn't fill the silence as if it were dangerous. He glanced up, ready to cut short whatever excess cheer or trembling hesitation she offered. Instead, he found her standing steady, gaze direct, expression calm. "You're new," he said, testing. "Not really," she replied, "just not afraid." For the briefest moment something shifted, an almost imperceptible flicker across his features, as if her words had knocked a rhythm out of sync. He recovered quickly, lips curling in a half-smile that wasn't quite humor. "We'll see." She placed the folded napkin exactly once, not twice, with the precision of someone who knew details mattered but who wouldn't exaggerate them to win favor. "I don't hover," she added when he waved a dismissive hand. "I check in." It was a simple exchange, no more than a minute long, but Kyle noticed. He noticed the absence of fear, the lack of trembling, the refusal to flatter. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't performance. It was steadiness, something rarer than submission and far more difficult to ignore. For the first time in months, Kyle found himself paying attention, not because of what someone wanted from him, but because of what they refused to give away. Strength is often mistaken for noise, raised voices, bold declarations, grand gestures meant to prove control. But the kind of strength that lasts, the kind that bends the course of a night or the path of a life, rarely arrives with spectacle. Vivian showed it in the way she didn't rush to fill silence. She showed it in the way her hand set the glass down without trembling, the way her tone stayed even when faced with a man others treated like a storm cloud. She didn't have to roar to be heard. She didn't have to dominate to hold her place. Kyle's reputation thrived on the idea that people would bend, that fear would do the work for him. Yet when Vivian refused to bend, she didn't confront him with defiance or challenge. She simply remained herself. And that quiet refusal unsettled him more than any loud opposition could have. Her steadiness became its own form of power. The dining room saw it, Celine saw it, Orion, watching from his corner, saw it. And perhaps most importantly, Cale saw it. Not a performance, not a mask. Just a single mother who understood that dignity is not something others grant you, it is something you carry within and protect by standing still when the world expects you to flinch. That night, strength was not the man in the tailored coat who made rooms grow quiet. Strength was the woman who kept her peace, and by doing so, reminded everyone watching that silence doesn't always mean surrender, and calm can speak louder than any roar. The exchange at the window table might have seemed ordinary to an outsider, just a server and a patron, water set down, a few clipped words passed between them. But for those who knew Kyle Vayner's reputation, it was anything but ordinary. The fact that Vivian had not faltered, not hedged her tone, not hurried her steps, that alone was enough to set whispers fluttering between servers carrying trays and guests watching from the edges of their plates. Yet Vivian did not seek an audience. She returned to the service station, adjusted her order slips, and went about her tasks as though nothing remarkable had taken place. But inside there was a quiet affirmation. Her peace was intact, her ground was still hers, and that was victory enough. The night moved on, courses served, tables turned. Still, something lingered at the window. Kyle's eyes, sharp as ice, followed her more than once, not out of suspicion, not yet curiosity. But from an unsettled awareness, this woman did not behave as expected. She had shifted something small but undeniable. It would not be the last time. Because what Vivian carried into that dining room was not a momentary burst of bravery. It was the product of years of practice, of small decisions made in kitchens, apartments, sidewalks, and quiet corners where no one was watching. To understand her steadiness that night, you must know where it began. And so we turn the page from the prologue to the first chapter of her life's lesson, where courage truly begins. Courage did not arrive for Vivian Arlo as a sudden blaze. It crept into her life in moments so small most people would have missed them. It began the night she taped Orion's first crayon sketch to the fridge instead of another overdue notice. Bill's reminded her of what she lacked. His drawing reminded her of what she still had. That choice, what to look at every morning, was an act of defiance against despair. It continued the day she stopped apologizing for needing help. She had walked into her manager's office rehearsing sorry half a dozen times. Instead, she said, "I need more hours." Her voice quivered at the edges, but it carried through. She walked out not with an apology, but with extra shifts. There was the winter when her shoes split at the seams, and instead of hiding the wear with shame, she laughed with Orion about how many sidewalks they had conquered together. She chose to turn lack into a story of endurance, not embarrassment. And there were countless evenings when exhaustion whispered that she should skip reading a bedtime story. But she opened the book anyway, even if her eyelids sagged between paragraphs. Orion would lean against her, eyes wide at dragons and heroes, and she realized, I am giving him courage word by word. By the time Cale Vayner sat at her table, Vivian's steadiness was not a mask she put on for him. It was the result of hundreds of decisions, each one a stone in the foundation she had built. So when she said she wasn't afraid, it wasn't performance. It was the truth of a woman who had already faced storms, learned to name them, and chosen, every time, to keep walking forward. And Kyle, accustomed to people bending in his presence, had just encountered something rare, a strength that didn't announce itself, but one that could not be ignored. Kyle Vayner had not been born into the world he now commanded. His beginnings were modest. His parents, the kind of people who measured worth in hours worked rather than words, spoken. His father was a machinist who came home late, hands scarred from steel and grease. His mother ran a corner shop where the shelves were stocked more with necessity than indulgence. They provided, they endured, but affection in the household was doled out sparingly, almost like a ration. Kyle grew up learning that attention had to be earned, and often earned twice before it lasted a second longer. Praise was rare, so he chased achievement as if it were oxygen. A perfect score on an exam, a prize in debate, a scholarship earned through sheer grit. Each victory gave him a brief glimmer of approval. Then it vanished, and he was left hungry again. By the time he reached adulthood, Kyle had absorbed a lesson that would shape his life. Control was safer than vulnerability. He discovered that if he mastered his surroundings, kept people at a distance, and expected failure before it arrived, he would never have to face the sting of disappointment unguarded. So he built. He bought failing companies and restructured them with relentless efficiency. He filled magazines with stories of turnaround success, cementing his reputation as a man who could bend broken systems into profit. To outsiders, this was brilliance. To Kyle, it was survival. Every acquisition, every late-night strategy meeting, every ruthless decision was less about money and more about proving, perhaps to parents who had long since stopped watching, that he was worthy of something more than silence. But with every layer of achievement came another layer of frost. He learned to speak in clipped tones that left little room for misinterpretation. He timed meetings with precision, never lingering on pleasantries. He built walls so high that no one questioned what stood behind them. And as long as he kept moving, deal after deal, project after project, he never had to stop long enough to feel the emptiness in the quiet spaces of his life. Kyle was not born cold. He taught himself to be, because warmth, he believed, was dangerous, and control was the only shield he trusted. Kyle was used to being studied. In boardrooms, assistants watched his reactions, trying to read his silence the way sailors read the horizon. In restaurants, staff rehearsed how to approach him, adjusting their tone, their words, even their posture to match what they thought he wanted. It was a constant performance staged around his presence. But Vivian did not perform. When she returned with his meal, steak cooked exactly to his preference, pepper in a separate dish, an extra napkin folded once, her actions were deliberate, but not deferential. She didn't hover to see if he approved, nor did she hurry away as though escaping his notice. She placed each detail with the same attention she gave to any other guest, then steadied herself beside the table long enough to meet his eyes. "You like pepper on the side," she said, as though stating a simple fact, and the napkin folded once, not twice. Kyle looked up sharply. "You watch everyone like this?" "I pay attention," she replied. "It saves time, and it shows care." Her words were not flattery. They weren't meant to soften him or to score points. They were plain observations, spoken with a quiet assurance that startled him more than any compliment could. He leaned back, lips parting as if to offer a retort. The old reflex, the one that dismissed, corrected, cut short, rose to the surface. But instead of striking it, he paused. Something about the steadiness in her expression made the words feel unnecessary, even hollow. When he finally spoke, the comment came slower than he intended. "Care is inefficient." Vivian set down the last item, water pitcher cool in her hand. "No," she said softly. "Care is a choice to value people. That's what makes the rest worth doing." Kyle said nothing. He picked up his fork instead, though he realized, without understanding why, that he was tasting his food more slowly than usual. Her words lingered, pressing gently against the edges of his armor, not forcing their way in, but making him aware that cracks could exist. For the first time in years, he felt himself being seen not as an empire to manage, but as a man who still needed to be reminded that kindness had value. Vivian understood something most people missed. Behavior and essence are not the same. A habit might be sharp, defensive, or even cold, but that doesn't always mean the heart beneath it is frozen. Kyle's reputation in the city was built on his habits. He cut meetings short, dismissed excuses, and demanded results at a pace few could match. To his staff, that translated as arrogance. To his rivals, it looked like ruthlessness. To strangers, it felt like distance, and over time those habits became the story people told about him. He's impossible. He's harsh. He doesn't care. But Vivian didn't confuse the story with the man. She noticed what others overlooked: the quiet gesture when he tipped the dishwasher directly, the way he glanced at the staff families in the corner without irritation, the slight softening in his voice when asking about details no one else had remembered. Small signals slipped through the cracks of his frost, enough to suggest that his core was different from his habits. That's why she could stand at his table without shrinking. She wasn't contending with a monster. She was simply speaking to a man whose defenses had become second nature. And she knew something about second nature. It could be changed. The lesson was clear. People's habits are the armor they build to survive, but armor is not identity. If you only ever respond to the armor, you never touch the person underneath. Vivian didn't challenge Kyle's habits with aggression. She didn't try to dismantle them on the spot. Instead, she addressed him as though the person behind them was still reachable. And in doing so, she revealed a truth that would ripple through every exchange that followed. A man's exterior may be guarded, but his heart might still be waiting for someone to see it. The storm came not from Kyle that night, but from someone tied to his world. A week later, the restaurant door swung open, and in walked one of his business associates, a man flushed with success and entitlement. His tie loosened, his voice already a notch too loud for the room. He waved at the host as though dismissing him and claimed a table with the air of someone who believed his presence was favor enough. When Vivian approached to take his order, he leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy with arrogance. "Bring me a drink," he said, careless in tone and a smile. "I've had a day." The room stiffened. Servers exchanged uneasy glances. The demand carried the weight of someone used to people giving in. But Vivian didn't falter. She stood with the same calm she carried to Kyle's table days before. "You can have the drink," she said politely. "The smile is for free when you treat me with respect." The associate blinked, then laughed, more surprised than offended. A bold one. From across the dining room, Kyle observed, posture straightening. His instinct was immediate: step in, shut down the behavior, impose his presence until the man retreated. It was the reflex that had kept boardrooms orderly and staff compliant. But Celine, passing with a tray, whispered quickly, "Don't. She can handle this." Kyle hesitated. He wasn't accustomed to trusting others to manage conflict, yet he stopped, tension coiled but restrained, and watched. Vivian returned with a tall glass of water, clear and steady as her voice. She set it down before the associate. "Start with this. You can order something stronger once you've cooled off." The man frowned. "That's not what I asked for." "It's what you need," Vivian replied evenly. "And I'll listen if you'd like to talk, but I won't be spoken to like a doormat." Her words carried no heat, no raised volume, only calm firmness. The dining room hushed for a moment, the way fields fall quiet when wind drops unexpectedly. Then the associate chuckled, shaking his head. "Fair enough." He lifted the water and drank. The edge in his posture softened, and what could have become an ugly display instead dissolved into an ordinary evening. Vivian turned, unhurried, and continued her shift. Her boundary had held not through anger but through clarity, and from his table Kyle felt something rare, respect born not of fear, but of admiration. Kyle had spent years believing that the only way to correct disorder was to crush it. In boardrooms, he silenced dissent before it could grow teeth. In negotiations, he struck first so no one could strike him later. His instinct, honed through years of survival, was simple: control the situation or be consumed by it. So when the associate barked at Vivian, Kyle's reflex was immediate. He pushed back his chair, every nerve ready to deliver the kind of reprimand that would leave no room for debate. His presence alone could have ended the scene. He knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. But then Celine's words brushed past him. "She can handle this." He paused. His eyes tracked Vivian as she set the glass of water down, as she met the associate's stare without hostility, as she answered his demand with a steady refusal. Her calm was sharper than any command Kyle could have given, and it worked. The man backed down, disarmed not by fear, but by dignity. Kyle lowered himself back into his chair, unsettled. For the first time in years, he allowed someone else to carry the weight of conflict while he stood still. It felt unnatural, yet strangely right. As he watched her walk away, shoulders squared, pace unbroken, a realization struck him with surprising force. True authority did not always need to dominate. Sometimes it needed only to stand firm. Vivian hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't invoked status. She hadn't played the role of enforcer. She had simply been unmovable in her self-respect, and that had shifted the outcome more effectively than any intimidation ever could. For Kyle, who had built his life on command, this was a revelation. Strength wasn't only in control. Sometimes it was in the choice to let another's quiet certainty do what force never could. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Kyle admired not dominance, but restraint. Later that evening, Kyle lingered at his table longer than usual, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling beside him. His eyes were not on the paperwork he had brought, but on the quiet rhythm of the dining room. He replayed the earlier scene in his mind, the sharpness of the associate's tone, the poised steadiness of Vivian's reply, the way the entire atmosphere had shifted without a single raised voice. It unsettled him. Not because he disapproved, but because it exposed a gap in his own methods. For years, his response to disruption had been immediate and heavy-handed. He cut down arguments before they grew, silenced critics with the weight of his position, and made sure everyone knew that challenging him carried a cost. It was efficient. It worked. Or so he had always believed. But watching Vivian had forced a question he hadn't considered in years. Had his methods truly earned respect, or just fear? She hadn't relied on authority. She hadn't invoked anyone's name, and yet she had been obeyed. Not grudgingly, but willingly. The associate hadn't stormed out or retaliated. He had accepted her terms with a kind of reluctant acknowledgement. Kyle thought of his boardrooms, where silence reigned not out of harmony, but out of caution. He thought of his employees who completed tasks flawlessly but avoided eye contact. He thought of the rare moments when someone had dared to speak honestly, and how quickly he had crushed those moments under the guise of efficiency. Vivian had done the opposite. She had invited honesty but refused disrespect, and somehow that balance carried more weight than any intimidation tactic he had ever used. For the first time in a long while, Kyle wondered if power might not be about pressing harder, but about knowing when to stand back and let steadiness do the work. When the night finally quieted, Kyle found himself watching Vivian in the small, unnoticed moments. The way she adjusted a tray with one hand while steadying a passing busser with the other. The way she checked on Orion at the corner table, her hand brushing his shoulder with a gentleness that carried more authority than any command. The way she smiled, not wide, not forced, but steady, as though the world could shake around her and she would still be anchored. It was not the kind of strength Kyle was used to. His was loud in its own way, numbers, headlines, signatures that closed deals. Hers was quiet, lived out in choices so ordinary they risked being overlooked, yet together they built something unshakable. He realized then that the room had not bent to his presence tonight. Not entirely. It had bent around hers. She had drawn a line for a man who thought himself untouchable, and he had listened. She had stood before Kyle without fear, and he had noticed. She had reminded the entire restaurant that power doesn't always shout. It sometimes simply refuses to yield. As Kyle gathered his things and rose from his seat, he felt the weight of a truth he hadn't considered before. Strength was not always about control. Sometimes the greatest power belonged to the person who remained unshaken, no matter how fierce the storm. And for the first time in years, Kyle Vaynor, the man everyone feared, walked out of the restaurant not thinking of himself, but of the quiet strength of the woman who had refused to give away her ground. Dinner service was winding down. The clatter of cutlery had faded into the occasional scrape of a chair. The kitchen's rhythm had slowed to a steady hum, and the restaurant exhaled that familiar sigh of near-closing time. Kyle remained at his usual place by the window, posture still exact, his focus fixed on the documents spread before him. But at the corner table, Orion closed his sketchbook with a decisive tap. He had been working quietly, pencil moving in quick strokes, erasing and redrawing until the page was filled. Now, with the small courage that comes when children decide the moment is right, he slid off his chair, sketchbook tucked to his chest. Step by step, he crossed the room. No one stopped him, though Celine raised an eyebrow and Vivian, balancing a tray, caught the motion out of the corner of her eye. She didn't interfere. Orion's steps were his own to take. He stopped at Kyle's table, small shadow framed by the glow of the city lights behind him. "Sir?" His voice was soft, but carried the clarity of someone used to being listened to at home. Kyle looked up, expecting a server, and instead found a boy standing in front of him, holding out a page. The drawing was of the city skyline, towers leaning tall, windows dotted with light. In one corner, a restaurant glowed brighter than the rest, almost like a lantern. "This place is my favorite," Orion said simply. "Mom says some places teach you how to breathe." Kyle stared at the drawing. Something in his chest tightened, foreign and uncomfortable. He had been offered business cards, proposals, contracts, but never this. "You can keep it if you want," Orion added, without hesitation, the offer free of calculation. Kyle didn't move at first. He was not used to gifts that asked for nothing in return. The silence stretched, then softened. Slowly, almost carefully, he reached for the page. "Thank you," he said. It was only 2 words, but they landed heavier than most speeches he had given in his life. Orion lingered for a moment, rocking gently on his heels, his face open and unguarded. "Mom says strength isn't about being loud," he offered, almost as if sharing a secret. "It's about being gentle when you could be tough." Kyle blinked. The words landed awkwardly at first, then settled deeper than he expected. He glanced toward the corner of the room where Vivian was arranging plates at another table. She hadn't heard her son, but Kyle realized she didn't need to. Orion's voice carried her lessons in every syllable. He looked back down at the drawing, the glowing restaurant, the warm light spilling from it, and for a brief second he saw himself reflected in the boy's lines. Not as the towering figure everyone avoided, not as the cold man who walked into rooms and froze them solid, but as someone standing near the glow of a space where people felt safe. Orion's trust was simple, almost disarming. He had walked up to Kyle without hesitation, without fear of rejection, without the calculations adults lived by. And that trust didn't appear out of nowhere. It had been nurtured. Kyle recognized that it came from Vivian's steady hand, from the way she modeled calm strength every day, from the way she taught her son that courage doesn't need to roar to be real. For Kyle, it was a mirror held up without warning. He saw Vivian's resilience reflected in her child, and through it, he began to glimpse the kind of strength he had never valued before. The kind that didn't conquer rooms, but steadied them. Something flickered inside him, not a change, not yet, but a shift. When Orion turned and padded back to his corner table, Kyle kept the drawing in his hands longer than he intended. The lines were uneven, the buildings leaned slightly, but the heart of it was unmistakable, warmth radiating from a place meant to be ordinary. To a child, that warmth mattered more than skyscrapers or fortune. Kyle glanced once more at Vivian. She had not seen the exchange, yet her presence was stamped across every pencil stroke. Orion had approached without fear because she had taught him that dignity is not negotiable. He had offered his drawing without condition because she had shown him that generosity does not require wealth. and he had spoken of strength with a wisdom that exceeded his years because he had watched her live it day after day. It was then Kyle understood children are not born with courage already shaped. They absorb it from the air their parents breathe, from the choices they witness, from the values that guide the small rhythms of daily life. Orion's calm certainty was not an accident. It was Vivian's quiet teaching, reflected back with the unfiltered honesty only a child can give. The lesson was clear. If you want to know the true measure of a person, look at what they pass on. A child's trust, resilience, and kindness are not mere traits. They are echoes of the examples they've been shown. And in that moment, Kyle realized he was not only facing a mother who stood her ground, he was facing the legacy of her strength, living proof sketched in pencil by the boy who carried her lessons like second nature. It was humbling. It was disarming. And it was the first time Kyle Vayner wondered if all the power he had built in his world meant less than the quiet authority Vivian had already passed to her son. The restaurant had thinned to silence by the time Vivian finished closing. Orion was asleep on the staff bench, his head tipped against his backpack, his breathing steady. Celine offered her a ride home, but Vivian shook her head. She preferred the quiet walk, even in the rain that had begun to tap steadily against the glass. There was a peace in carrying her son through streets softened by water and night. She gathered Orion into her arms, his weight familiar and grounding, and stepped into the drizzle. The air was cool, the pavement glistening with silver reflections. She adjusted her coat, prepared for the long walk, when a voice stopped her. "Miss Arlo." She turned. Under the yellow wash of a streetlight stood Kyle Vayner, umbrella in hand. His coat looked too fine for weather like this, but he held the umbrella not above himself alone. It was tilted, as if waiting to cover her and the boy. "You don't have to," she began. "I know," he interrupted, then cleared his throat, tone softening. "But I'd like to. You'd be doing me a favor. I don't like rain." The admission startled her. Vulnerability wasn't something she expected from him. After a moment, she nodded. "All right." They fell into step, Kyle angling the umbrella to shield all three of them. The rhythm of rain became their background, steady and unhurried. For several streets, he was quiet, as though searching for words. Finally, he spoke. "I owe you an apology." Vivian adjusted Orion gently on her hip. "For what?" "For my assumptions." His voice was rougher now, stripped of its usual precision. "I walk into rooms expecting people to fail me. It makes me efficient. It also makes me unpleasant. You didn't deserve the way I treated you when we first spoke." The sincerity in his tone surprised her more than the words themselves. He wasn't bargaining or explaining, he was admitting. And in the softened hush of rain, it mattered more than if he had said it in front of 1,000 witnesses. Vivian let the silence hold for a breath before answering. "Thank you for saying it." It was simple, but her acceptance was steady enough to make him glance at her, as though the umbrella didn't just shield them from rain, but from the habits he was beginning to question. They turned a corner, passing a bookstore with its lights dimmed, titles faintly visible in the display window. Orion shifted in Vivian's arms, murmuring something half-dreamed, then settling back into sleep. Kyle glanced at the window, then at her. "You don't seem surprised by me. Most people either flinch or flatter. You don't do either." Vivian smiled faintly. "That's because I don't read people as if they're finished." He frowned, puzzled. "Finished?" She shifted the umbrella slightly, droplets sliding down its edges. "Everyone's life is a book. Some chapters are bitter, some are kind, some are messy. But none of them are the whole story. The mistake most people make is thinking they know someone because they've read a few difficult pages." Kyle slowed his steps, the metaphor lingering in his mind like an unfamiliar language he wanted to master. "So, what chapter do you think I'm in?" Vivian didn't answer immediately. She looked ahead where the rain pooled under the glow of another street lamp, turning the road into liquid gold. "That's not for me to decide," she said at last. "But I can tell you this. You don't have to let the hardest chapters dictate the ending. They're just part of the book. You get to write the rest." Her words landed with a weight he hadn't expected. For so long, Kyle had believed his chapters were already written, carved in stone by the demands of his past. Yet here was a woman reminding him that stories aren't cement, they evolve. He said nothing more, but his silence wasn't cold. It was the silence of someone turning over an idea, one that might change how he read his own life. By the next week, the city's favorite pastime, talking, had found new material. Patrons who had witnessed Kyle lingering longer than usual at the restaurant, or walking Vivian home beneath a single umbrella, carried whispers out into streets and coffee shops. "He never stays anywhere that long. She must have caught his eye. Or maybe she's playing him. You don't stand that close to Vayner without a reason." The speculation grew with each retelling, threads twisted by envy, curiosity, or idle amusement. For Vivian, the shift was tangible. Some regulars glanced at her with pity, others with suspicion. A few even smiled too knowingly, as though they were in on a secret she had never told. Celine noticed first. "Ignore them," she said, stacking menus with more force than necessary. People love to invent stories, especially when they don't understand the real one, but ignoring whispers was harder than it sounded. They seeped into the quiet between shifts, brushed against Vivian as she passed tables, and reached even the staff. A waiter muttered under his breath one night, "Careful, Viv. Men like that don't come without strings." Vivian did not argue. She only met his eyes with a calm steadiness until the words lost their power and the waiter looked away. Yet inside she felt the pressure tightening, the weight of carrying dignity while others tried to chip at it with rumor. Kale, for his part, remained outwardly unchanged. He neither acknowledged nor denied the whispers, but when he caught the glance of a patron who lingered too long on Vivian, his jaw set and the air around him cooled. The tension was real, an invisible current that threatened to pull them both into a story they hadn't chosen. And in that pressure, Vivian faced the question that mattered more than the gossip itself: whose voice would she allow to define her? Vivian had learned long ago that opinions multiplied like weeds, quick, relentless, and often rooted in nothing true. If she tried to pluck them all, she would spend her life exhausted, her hands full of thorns. Instead, she chose to tend what she could control, the soil of her own values. Each morning before her shift, she clipped a photo of Orion to the inside pocket of her bag. Not because she needed a reminder of him, his laughter was stitched into her days, but because the picture anchored her. Whenever the whispers itched under her skin, she slipped her hand into her pocket, touched the photo, and remembered. Her worth wasn't debated in side conversations. It was lived in the way she raised her son. At the restaurant, she carried herself the same as always, apron neat, voice steady, steps purposeful. When one of the pastry chefs asked slyly, "So, when's the wedding, Viv?" she didn't shrink or lash out. She simply said, "When kindness is mistaken for ambition, I take it as proof people still underestimate kindness." Then she went back to her work, leaving the chef blinking at her clarity. Celine pressed her one evening, lemons balanced in her arms. "How do you stay so calm? Doesn't it get under your skin?" Vivian smiled faintly. "Of course it does. But calm isn't the absence of frustration. It's the decision not to let frustration steer." She paused, setting down a stack of plates. "I act from care, honesty, and dignity. That's my compass. If I let gossip dictate my steps, I'd lose myself before I ever lost Kale." At home, Orion noticed too. When a neighbor hinted at her new company with a raised brow, Vivian only laughed and asked Orion to help her water the plant by the window. Later, as they tucked the watering can away, Orion asked, "Why didn't you say something back?" She kissed the top of his head. Because not every question deserves an answer. What matters is that I know who I am, and you know who I am. That's enough. In choosing this path, she discovered a subtle freedom. When you stop trying to silence every whisper, they lose their grip. The voices around her might speculate, but they no longer carried authority. Only her values did. Change didn't come to Kyle in a single gesture. It began in increments so subtle most people would miss them. But Vivian noticed. She always noticed. He started with the staff. Instead of his usual curt nod, he learned names. When the dishwasher's shift ended late, Kyle left an envelope with cab fare tucked under a thank you note. When a prep cook burned her hand, he quietly arranged for her medical bill to be covered. No announcement, no ceremony. Vivian saw the way the kitchen staff whispered about it afterward, not with suspicion, but with something like relief. He didn't even want credit, Celine murmured one night, almost incredulous. Just said take care of yourself. Kyle also softened his presence at the table. The once icy instructions gave way to simple courtesies. Instead of demanding, he asked. Instead of critiquing every minor detail, he complimented the rosemary bread. He even thanked Vivian one evening for consistency, which, from him, sounded almost like admiration. What struck Vivian most, though, wasn't the grand gestures but the quiet ones. The way he adjusted his tone when speaking to a nervous new waiter, the way he lingered to hold the door for an elderly couple leaving the restaurant, the way he slowed his pace, not much, just enough, to match Orion's shorter stride when they once happened to leave together. These weren't performances. They weren't polished statements meant to repair an image. They were choices, small and deliberate. And Vivian recognized them for what they were, the beginning of someone allowing gentleness to surface where control had once been armor. She didn't rush to praise him. Instead, she gave him the same gift she had offered from the beginning: steady acknowledgement without embellishment. When he passed her at the counter and asked softly, "Did I handle that better tonight?" she simply replied, "Yes." It made a difference. That was enough. For him, for her, and for the fragile trust growing between them. One night, long after the last dinner guests had left, the restaurant felt quieter than usual. The lights dimmed to a golden hush, chairs stacked in neat rows, the faint scent of herbs and butter, clinging to the air. Vivian wiped down the counter with the same unhurried rhythm she used for everything, present, steady, never rushing the moment. The door opened, and Kyle stepped inside. He wasn't in his usual armor of brisk steps and sharp lines. His shoulders sagged, his tie hung loose, and for once, he looked less like a man commanding a boardroom and more like someone searching for air. Vivian noticed but didn't prod. She poured hot water into a cup, slid it across the counter, and said only, "Sit." Her tone wasn't soft out of pity or hard out of command. It was an invitation, plain and firm. Kyle hesitated, then lowered himself onto the stool. He wrapped his hands around the cup, holding the heat as though it anchored him. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. But it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the sort of silence that gives a person room to breathe. Finally, Kyle spoke. Not about profits, not about problems to fix. Instead, he admitted, "I walked away from a call tonight. For the first time, I didn't fight to be right. I just let it go." Vivian didn't rush to respond. She nodded once. "That sounds like peace." The words startled him, not because they were grand, but because they named something he hadn't recognized. Peace. A word he hadn't associated with himself in years. They talked a little after that, about Orion's latest drawing, about Kyle's failed attempt at making breakfast years ago, about nothing and everything. Each exchange softened the space between them until it felt less like a server and a billionaire and more like two people learning to sit without armor. When Kyle left that night, he didn't thank her in his usual clipped way. He paused at the door, looked back, and said, "I'm glad I came here. Vivian smiled, not wide, not shy, but steady, the kind that meant she believed him. And for Kyle, that belief was worth more than any deal he had ever signed. Lesson: closeness grows where people feel safe to bring their true selves, not their performances. Closing time had folded the restaurant into a hush. Chairs were stacked, the floor gleamed, and the last notes of conversation had faded into the soft hum of the street outside. Vivian stood at the counter, rolling a clean cloth over the wood in slow, even strokes. Kyle lingered near the door as if deciding whether to stay or leave, his tie loosened, his expression unguarded. "Good night," she said, not a farewell so much as a gentle nudge. He stepped closer. "Thank you. For the tea, for earlier, a pause, for letting me be a person and not just a name." Something eased in her shoulders. She didn't move away when his hand brushed hers as she set the cloth aside. The contact was brief, skin to skin, nothing more, but it carried the kind of honesty words often bruise. Vivian didn't snatch her hand back, didn't make light of it. She let the touch exist, and in that allowance a door opened. His thoughts, Kyle felt the quiet shock of it. He had shaken hands that sealed fortunes without a tremor, yet this simple brush made him aware of his own pulse. He realized how rarely he touched without purpose. Contracts, signatures, pens sliding across glass tables. His hands knew those rituals. They did not know this, a moment that asked for no outcome, only presence. Her thoughts, Vivian noticed the way he stood, held but not holding on. Control lived in his posture like an old habit, yet there was something new at the edges, a willingness to listen for the first time, even to his own heart. She was careful with her hope. She had learned to be. But care did not mean fear. It meant clarity. They walked to the door together. Rain freckled the glass. The city, softened by night, felt close and kind. They walked to the door together. Rain freckled the glass. The city, softened by night, felt close and kind. He turned to her, question in his eyes before it reached his mouth. "May I?" She weighed more than a moment. Orion asleep at home, the years she had spent stitching herself together, the vow never to trade her peace for anyone's charm. Then she nodded. "Yes." Kyle leaned in slowly, giving her time to change her mind. Their lips met, no grab, no rush, just a careful press that felt like an agreement. Vivian exhaled against the corner of his mouth, and he steadied a hand at her shoulder, not to claim, but to ask again without words. "Is this still all right?" It was. She let the kiss linger, then drew back first, her eyes open and clear. He didn't chase the moment, he honored its size. For a breath, they stood close, the kind of closeness that holds rather than consumes. He smiled, small and real. "I've closed deals with less shaking than that." She laughed under her breath. "Maybe you're finally doing something that matters." He didn't argue. He looked at her as a man who understood cost and chose to pay it anyway, and for once not in money. They did not rush what followed. The next evening, Kyle arrived earlier than usual and chose a different seat, closer to the counter where the staff moved in their nightly choreography. He didn't beckon, he waited until Vivian was free. When she came by, he asked, "How was Orion's day?" before mentioning the menu. It was a small order of priorities, but it said everything. Their pace became a choice. He walked her to the corner after closing, then no farther, because she said that's where she liked to carry the rest of the night on her own. He respected that. She texted once to say, "Home safe." He replied, "Thank you for letting me know," and left it there. No tug, no insistence. On nights they spoke longer, they set terms for themselves, no promises they couldn't keep, no grand declarations to cover uncertainty, no late-hour decisions that would look different in daylight. They talked about ordinary things, the stubborn plant by Vivian's window, Orion's new comic, the way Kyle once ruined eggs in a pan and still felt embarrassed about it. Ordinary was the point. Ordinary was proof that this wasn't a performance. Kyle began to practice asking before assuming. Do you want company on your walk? Would you rather I sit at the counter or the table? Is tonight a good night to talk? Each question drew a line of trust, neat and visible. Vivian answered honestly, sometimes yes, sometimes not tonight, and watched him accept both with the same ease. That steadiness mattered more than flowers ever could. Vivian, for her part, kept her life intact. She didn't skip Orion's bedtime for late dinners. She didn't trade shifts for spontaneous escapes. She invited Kyle into the edges of her routines only when the core felt undisturbed. If he called during homework hour, she sent a simple message, I'll call back after stories. He learned to love that boundary because it told him who she was. Their touch stayed measured. Fingers brushed when a cup changed hands. A palm rested at the small of her back only when a crowded doorway needed negotiating. Kisses were unhurried, never timed to a clock, never used to patch what words should repair. If tension nudged them, they paused, spoke plainly, and let closeness follow conversation, not replace it. The intention showed up in their goodbyes. They did not stall at doorways to stretch a moment past comfort. They ended the night while it was still gentle, so they would want to return to it. They were building something that did not depend on adrenaline or spectacle, something that could stand a work week, a tired morning, a late bill, an uncertain headline. One evening, as they cleaned the counter together, Kyle said, I'm learning to want what I can sustain. Vivian wrung out the cloth and met his eyes. Good, because that's the only kind of wanting that lasts. For Kyle, love had always been tangled with conquest. Every relationship before now had carried the tempo of urgency, lavish gifts, grand dinners, gestures designed to impress. They burned bright, then burned out, leaving him convinced that intimacy was either fleeting or burdensome. But with Vivian, something different emerged. There was no chase, no performance. There was steadiness, like the rhythm of a heartbeat that never demanded attention yet sustained life all the same. Vivian understood this truth long before him. As a mother, she had already learned that the strongest bonds were not built in fireworks but in routines. The nightly story before bed, the quiet check-in after school, the steady presence that told Orion, I'm here, and I'll still be here. Tomorrow. She knew love wasn't about the rush of newness, but about the decision to keep showing up, even when the moment wasn't glamorous. When Kyle reached for her hand across the table one evening, he didn't grip it as though claiming victory. He rested his palm lightly over hers, steady and warm, waiting to see if she would meet him there. She did, and in that quiet exchange they both understood something deeper. They weren't sprinting toward a finish line. They were building a foundation that could weather silence, storms, and ordinary days alike. For the first time, Kyle realized he did not want the kind of affection that demanded constant spectacle. He wanted the kind that could sit in stillness without turning restless, the kind that didn't need proving because it lived in the patterns of daily life. And so the lesson became clear. Real love is steady, not rushed. It thrives not in the urgency to arrive somewhere, but in the patience to remain, to listen, to grow slowly enough for trust to take root. The scandal broke without warning. A newly acquired subsidiary of Kyle's company had been operating under harsh conditions, long hours, poor wages, corners cut to maximize profit. The story hit the news, and the public response was swift. Commentators called it hypocrisy. Shareholders demanded immediate reassurance. His advisors gathered in the boardroom with a single recommendation: distance. Don't admit fault, one said flatly. Blame the old management, another suggested. Make a statement about restructuring and move on. This isn't personal, it's business. Kyle listened, jaw tight. Once he would have taken their advice without hesitation. Efficiency was the goal, reputation the currency. But now, the words rang hollow. Because when he thought of business, he no longer saw spreadsheets or quarterly reports. He saw faces, the dishwasher who received an envelope with cab fare, the prep cook with a bandaged hand, Vivian carrying a tray with Grace, Orion sketching light into city buildings. He stood, pushing back his chair with quiet force. "Business is people," he said. His advisors exchanged glances, startled, some even exasperated. Kyle didn't soften the words. "If we cut corners on people, what exactly are we building?" The press conference followed. Cameras crowded the stage, reporters leaned forward, pens ready. Instead of the polished denial prepared for him, Kyle spoke plainly. He acknowledged the failure. He apologized, not with theatrics, but with sincerity. Then he laid out new measures: fair wages, safer schedules, support systems for staff who had been overlooked. Every promise came with numbers, dates, and transparency. It was costly, it was unorthodox, and it was true. Some investors stormed out. The stock price trembled. But as Kyle stepped away from the podium, he felt something unfamiliar but grounding. A weight had lifted, not pressed down. He had chosen integrity over image, and for once he didn't feel smaller for it. He felt cleaner, clearer, as if he had stepped into alignment with something larger than profit. That night, instead of celebrating or lamenting, he went to the restaurant. He didn't need applause. He needed stillness. And he knew exactly where he might find it. The restaurant was nearly empty when Kyle walked in, shoulders weighted by the day's battle. Vivian was wiping down the counter, the steady rhythm of cloth on wood a sound that calmed more than he expected. She looked up, sensing the heaviness in him before he spoke. Without asking questions, she poured tea, set it in front of him, and said softly, "How is your heart?" The simplicity of the question disarmed him. Not how was the press, not what did the board say, just that, "How is your heart?" He stared into the cup for a long moment before admitting, scared, but right. Vivian leaned her hip against the counter, arms loosely folded. Scared means you care about the outcome. Right means you chose well. Those two can live together. He gave a short laugh, tired but genuine. "I worried it made me look weak. That's the word I kept hearing in my head when I stood up there." She shook her head slowly. "No, it made you look wise. Anyone can cling to control. It takes more strength to admit fault and change course." Her voice carried no embellishment, no attempt to soothe with flattery. She spoke as she always did, with clarity, not performance. And Kyle found himself clinging to her words more tightly than any applause he might have received. "I don't think I've ever wanted approval this badly," he confessed, half to himself. "Not from the board, not from the public, just from you." Vivian's expression softened. "You don't need my approval, Kale. You need your own. But for what it's worth, I'm proud of you." The words landed with surprising force. Pride wasn't something he had known much of growing up. Accomplishment had been expected, not celebrated. Hearing it now, offered gently and without agenda, released a tension he hadn't realized he carried. He reached across the counter, hand brushing hers, not for reassurance but to acknowledge the truth between them. She didn't pull away. That night, Kyle understood that wisdom and weakness were not opposites. Wisdom was often mistaken for weakness by those who didn't value people. But to those who did, like Vivian, it was the strongest choice a person could make. The backlash arrived quickly. Comment sections filled with accusations. "It's just for show. He's saving face. Don't trust a billionaire's apology." News pundits debated whether Kyle's move was bravery or strategy. Some admired his candor. Others dismissed it as calculated damage control. The noise grew louder than the facts. Inside his own boardroom, the reaction was colder. Charts were slammed onto tables, voices sharpened with warnings. "You've jeopardized our stability. Shareholders are rattled. If you keep this up, we'll lose confidence at every level." Kyle listened, but the arguments that once commanded his loyalty sounded strangely empty. He had always defined leadership as control, but now he began to see it as accountability. He didn't raise his voice. He simply repeated, "The changes stand." The silence that followed was filled with frustration, but also a grudging respect. In the quieter hours, away from cameras and conference tables, he walked with Vivian along the river. No guards, no staff trailing behind, just two people matching each other's steps. The city lights shimmered on the water, and Orion's laughter still echoed faintly in Kyle's memory from earlier that week. "They think you've lost your edge," Vivian said gently, not to wound but to acknowledge the weight. "Maybe I have," Kyle replied, eyes on the dark stretch of water. "But maybe an edge was never meant to be carried forever. It cuts the one who holds it as much as the one it points toward." Vivian glanced at him, her pace steady. "Let them talk. Your board will measure with numbers. Strangers will measure with gossip. But you," she touched her chest lightly, "you have to measure with this. If your decisions align here, the rest will find its place." He nodded, more at the truth of it than at her reassurance. The world's opinion was restless, fickle. But walking in the stillness beside Vivian, Kyle felt anchored. Not because the noise had lessened, but because her presence reminded him that the noise didn't define him. That night, as they reached her building, Kyle realized that he didn't need the world's applause, nor its doubt, to validate his choices. What mattered was whether he could look at himself without flinching, and whether the people closest to him, the ones who saw him unguarded, believed he was building something worth keeping. On another evening, they sat across from each other at the small kitchen table in Vivian's apartment. Orion had gone to bed after insisting on one more story, his sketchbook tucked under his pillow. The room smelled faintly of chamomile and rain drifting in from the window. Kyle leaned back, shoulders looser than usual, and said, "My board keeps asking about my image, what it means for me to soften, what it signals to the market." Vivian stirred her tea slowly. "And what do you think it signals?" "That I've chosen a different way," he admitted. "But they don't want different. They want consistent, predictable, cold even." She set her spoon down, gaze steady. "Image is what people see when they don't know you. Values are what guide you when no one's watching. Which matters more?" He paused, hearing the distinction settle inside him. "Values," he said finally, "but sometimes it feels like values are expensive." "They are," Vivian agreed softly, "but they're also the only thing you take with you when the applause fades. If you let your choices be driven by values instead of perception, you won't need to chase anyone's approval." Kyle studied her, the way she said it without hesitation, as if she had already tested the truth of it in her own life, and he realized she had. Every choice she made, from protecting her son's routines to drawing boundaries with entitled guests, came from values. That's why she stood steady when the world bent around her. "I want that," he said at last. "Not just for me, for us, for Orion." Vivian's expression softened into a smile, quiet but firm. "Then we keep aligning here." She tapped the table once, then touched her heart. "Not with what others say we should be, but with what we know we are." It wasn't a declaration or a vow. It was an agreement, plain and clear. And in that agreement, Kyle found more stability than any boardroom could ever offer. Lesson: love built on aligned values will outlast any image crafted for the world. The comment came wrapped in a smile. The kind of smile sharpened for gossip, designed to cut while looking graceful. The socialite leaned against the service station, her voice pitched just low enough to sound like a confidence, but just loud enough for others to hear. "You're very fortunate, Vivian," she said sweetly. "Not everyone catches the attention of Mr. Vaynor. Enjoy it while it lasts." Vivian set down the tray she was carrying. Her first instinct was heat, quick, sharp, but she had long ago learned that heat alone didn't hold ground. She steadied her breath, met the woman's eyes, and answered with a calm that turned heads more than anger ever could. I didn't catch anything, she said evenly. We chose each other, and if it doesn't last, I will still be whole. The socialite blinked, momentarily unsettled, as if she hadn't expected the target of her barb to carry such poise. You sound very sure of yourself. I am, Vivian replied. Her voice was steady, not raised, but carried far enough for anyone nearby to hear. Because my worth isn't borrowed from anyone's name. The dining room shifted, servers paused mid-step, a manager glanced over, a busboy froze with glasses in hand. There was no drama, no raised voice, just a woman standing inside her own dignity. The socialite faltered, then offered a tight smile before slipping away, leaving Vivian exactly as she had found her, still composed, still certain, still standing. In that moment, Vivian's declaration wasn't just about her. It was a lesson dropped quietly into the room. Strength doesn't require spectacle, it requires clarity. And clarity was what she had cultivated until it became unshakable. Kyle had entered the hall just in time to hear the last words leave Vivian's mouth. He had been on his way to the window table, paperwork still in hand, when her reply cut through the low murmur of the restaurant. My worth isn't borrowed from anyone's name. He stopped in the doorway. For years, Kyle had been the man people bent toward, out of fear, ambition, or calculation. He had grown used to deference, to the quiet ways people tried to attach themselves to his orbit. But Vivian's stance was different. She wasn't clinging to him, nor was she allowing anyone to diminish her. She was standing in her own right, equal, unshaken. He felt something shift in him, a mixture of pride and humility. Pride because she was unafraid to claim her independence, even in a world that prized proximity to power. Humility because it reminded him that she didn't need him to define her. She had her own gravity. Kyle lingered unseen, watching as she turned back to her work, unbothered by the ripples of her declaration. There was no glance in his direction to ask if he had heard, no need to seek his approval. She had spoken for herself, not for him. And that was the moment Kyle realized he wasn't rescuing Vivian, and she wasn't rescuing him. They weren't halves trying to complete each other. They were two whole people meeting at level ground. Later that night, when they finally crossed paths near the counter, Kyle simply said, "Thank you for standing your ground. Not against me, against the story the world tries to write for you." Vivian offered a small, steady smile. "I stood it for myself. And for Orion, and for what we're building." Her words landed like blueprints, not poetry. They weren't lofty, they were a foundation. And Kyle understood if he wanted to stand beside her, it would be as a partner, not a pedestal. A week later, Kyle invited Vivian and Orion to visit a community center he had quietly funded years before. The building stood on a corner lot, sturdy and bright with murals painted by local children. Kyle had written the checks, attended the ribbon cutting, but rarely returned. It had always been easier to give from a distance than to show up in person. This time, he showed up, and he brought them with him. Inside, the space hummed with life. The gym echoed with laughter as children chased basketballs across polished wood. A reading room smelled of crayons and worn paper, its shelves stacked with books that leaned like old friends. Orion's eyes lit up immediately. "Can I?" he asked, sketchbook already in hand, gaze darting toward an art table where kids were busy with glue, cardboard, and markers. Vivian smiled. "Go." Orion slipped into the group as though he'd always belonged, showing another boy how to fold a cardboard panel into the wing of a spaceship. Soon he was laughing with two girls over the color of stars, sketching constellations that spilled across the page. His voice carried easily, full of the openness children have before the world teaches them to hold back. Kyle watched, hands clasped behind his back. "He's fearless," he murmured. Vivian shook her head gently. "No, he feels safe here. That's different." Kyle absorbed the correction, looking around the room with new eyes. It wasn't just a center. It was a refuge, a place where kids didn't have to armor themselves to be seen. Watching Orion fold into the group, Kyle felt the quiet truth. Money had built the walls, but presence was what gave them life. One of the staff waved at him, grateful but surprised to see him linger. Kyle nodded, then turned back to Vivian. "I thought if kids could capture the world in their own way, they might feel more in control of their story," he said, almost uncertain. Vivian met his gaze steadily. "It doesn't sound uncertain." Vivian met his gaze steadily. "It doesn't sound uncertain. It sounds like hope." For the first time, Kyle realized that generosity wasn't measured by the size of the gift, but by the choice to stand where it mattered, shoulder to shoulder with those you hope to serve. And that afternoon, as Orion held up his spaceship to the group's applause, Kyle felt a belonging he hadn't expected, not just for himself. After Orion settled into the art corner, Vivian and Kyle wandered through the center side by side. They passed a photography studio where teens framed shots of one another against painted backdrops, then a music room alive with hesitant piano notes. Each space carried its own hum of possibility, stitched together by care rather than wealth alone. Kyle paused at a mural of a sunrise painted on one wall. He cleared his throat, his voice quieter than usual. "I used to think this was enough, writing checks, cutting ribbons, moving on. I thought, if the money flowed, my part was done." Vivian studied the mural, then turned to him. "And now? Now I see what I've been missing." He gestured to the rooms around them, where laughter, effort, and patience filled the air. "This isn't about investment returns. It's about showing up." Vivian's lips curved into a faint smile. Shared purpose always outlives applause. Her words sank deep. He looked at her then, really looked, at the steadiness in her eyes, at the way she stood with both feet planted firmly as if her very presence declared, "I belong here too." And Kyle realized something he hadn't said aloud before. Love for him wasn't just in stolen moments or gentle kisses. It was here, in the discovery that they both cared about building something that extended beyond themselves. As they returned to the art table, Orion tugged Vivian's sleeve, proud of the cardboard spaceship he and his new friends had taped together. "It's ours," he said brightly. "Not mine. Ours." Vivian brushed her hand over his hair. "Exactly." Kyle caught her gaze, and without a word they shared the recognition. This was what it meant to grow something together. Not an image, not a performance, a life rooted in shared values and purpose. And in that moment, love stopped being something fragile or uncertain. It became something practical and enduring, planted in the soil of giving, belonging, and care. It was Celine's idea. The restaurant had seen enough of Vivian's quiet strength to know it deserved acknowledgement. So, on a slow evening, the staff strung paper lanterns above the kitchen door, pooled tips for a cake, and called it a celebration. The frosting read in careful script, "To courage and kindness." Vivian walked in from the storeroom and stopped short at the sight. Her hand went to her mouth, but she didn't cry. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed spectacle. Still, her chest swelled at the thought that these people, her co-workers, her friends, saw her, honored her. Celine gave a short, teary speech that dissolved into a laugh halfway through. "You keep us brave, Viv, even when you don't mean to." She hugged her tightly and the whole room clapped. The kind of clapping that comes from the heart, not out of obligation. Then Kyle, uncharacteristically hesitant, asked if he could say something. The room quieted. He stood by the window table where it had all begun, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair. "When I first came here," he began, his voice steady but subdued, "I thought being right was more important than being kind. I thought control was the only way to lead." He paused, eyes shifting toward Vivian. "But someone reminded me that dignity isn't a luxury, it's a foundation. And I realized I've been served better than I deserved while I was still learning that lesson." The staff listened intently. They had endured his sharpness in the past, had braced themselves for his critiques. Hearing this acknowledgement felt like a balm. Kyle continued, "So thank you, to each of you, for the patience you gave me when I hadn't earned it. And to Vivian, you for seeing the person I could be, not only the man I had been." Silence followed, not the awkward kind but the weighty kind that means something important has just been named. Then Celine started clapping, and the room joined in, louder this time, until even the kitchen crew leaned out to see. Vivian didn't shrink from the attention. She accepted it calmly, standing steady under the lanterns. When the noise settled, she simply said, "We teach each other how to be brave. He taught me that power can be gentle. I taught him that gentleness can be powerful." No one missed the truth in it. When the applause faded, Vivian stood with the cake before her, lantern light softening the edges of the room. She had never been one for the spotlight, never sought the kind of attention that clung to Kyle wherever he went. Yet in that moment, the focus didn't feel like pressure. It felt like acknowledgement. Something she had earned not by striving for recognition, but by living with integrity day after day. She looked around the room, at Celine, whose eyes shone with pride, at the dishwasher, grinning wide, at the line cook, who raised a flour-dusted hand in salute. These were her people. They had seen her on tired nights, on double shifts, on days when laughter came slowly, and now they were offering her respect as naturally as a smile. Vivian didn't demur or brush it off. She accepted it with the same steadiness she carried into every part of her life. A quiet nod, a soft thank you, and the kind of smile that let everyone know she believed their gesture mattered. For Kyle, watching from the edge, it was a revelation. He had seen others crumble under public praise, turning shy or dismissive, as if they weren't sure they deserved it. Vivian didn't crumble. She didn't inflate either. She received it like water poured into a vessel already strong enough to hold it. Later, when the cake had been cut and the lanterns dimmed, Kyle joined her near the service station. "You wore it well," he said softly. "What's that?" she asked. "The respect. You didn't hide from it." Vivian shrugged lightly. "Respect is a gift. The kind you honor by accepting, not by pretending you're unworthy." Her answer lingered in him. She had shown him, yet again, that dignity wasn't about grandeur. It was about standing steady in who you are, even when the whole room is watching. And so the evening ended not with fanfare, but with something far more lasting. Vivian's quiet acceptance that she was worthy of being honored, and Kyle's growing realization that loving her meant learning to meet her at that level of strength. Lesson: public respect doesn't diminish humility, it deepens it when accepted with grace. Life did not suddenly transform into something cinematic. There were no fireworks each morning, no sweeping gestures every evening. Instead, the days unfolded with the kind of rhythm that builds a future. Vivian still rose early, packing Orion's lunch before her shift. KL, when his schedule allowed, joined them at the small kitchen table, sipping coffee from a mug that didn't match his tailored suits. Orion teased him once, "You don't look like a billionaire in that chair," and Kyle only smiled, finding relief in the ordinariness of it. The restaurant remained part of Vivian's life. She tied her apron, greeted familiar faces, and carried plates with the same grace as before. KL sometimes stopped by, not to command attention, but to quietly share tea or walk her home. No headlines captured those moments, and that was exactly what made them precious. For Orion, the new normal meant that Kyle occasionally appeared at soccer practices or art projects, not as a guest of honor, but as another adult cheering from the sidelines. It mattered more than anything else that he showed up, steady and unpretentious. What could have seemed ordinary to others, the laughter over Orion's knock-knock jokes, the late-night folding of laundry, the quiet meals where no one rushed, felt extraordinary to them. Because stability wasn't something Vivian had always known, and Kyle had spent years avoiding it. Now both found it to be a treasure, The power of their story was not in the moments that dazzled, but in the ordinary ones that proved lasting. One evening, the three of them walked home together after dinner at the restaurant. Orion skipped ahead, cardboard sword in hand, declaring himself a knight guarding the path. Vivian and Kyle followed, their pace slower, their silence companionable. When they reached the corner where the streetlights spilled soft halos on the pavement, Kyle stopped. He looked at Vivian with the careful seriousness of a man who had spent years rehearsing the wrong words and now wanted only the right ones. "I've been thinking about the word home," he began. "I've had plenty of houses, rooms with art I pretended to understand, hotels with views that looked impressive but felt empty. But home feels different. Home is where I don't have to perform, where I can just be present." Vivian tilted her head slightly, studying him. "And what are you asking?" He exhaled, as though admitting something that had lived in him too long. "I want to be present with you, with Orion, not as a visitor, not as someone passing through, but as part of your life. I'm not asking to replace anything or to erase the past. I'm asking if you'll let me step into what you already are, slowly, respectfully, honestly." The streetlight hummed softly above them. Orion had run a few steps ahead, then turned to shout, "Come on!" before dashing up the stairs to their building. Vivian watched him disappear inside, then looked back at Kyle. His words weren't polished, but they were real. And that, she knew, was far more valuable than any practiced charm. Vivian didn't rush to answer. She had built her life on patience, not impulse, and she weighed his request with the same care she gave every choice that touched Orion's world. At last she said, "Yes, Kyle, but we do it my way." He nodded once, listening. "Slow," she continued, "because anything rushed burns too quickly. Honest, because Orion deserves to grow up watching people tell the truth. And intentional. We don't let the world decide for us. We decide what kind of life we're building." Her tone was steady, neither defensive nor hesitant. It was the same clarity she'd shown that night with the socialite, the same strength she carried at the window table. And Kyle, hearing it, understood she wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting the soil of their future. "I can do that," he said quietly. "Slow, honest, intentional." Vivian's mouth curved into a small smile. "Good, then we'll try." It wasn't a dramatic declaration, nor was it fragile. It was a decision, a brick laid on solid ground. For Kyle, who had lived so long in a world of speed and strategy, it felt like the beginning of something real. For Vivian, it felt like confirmation that she could open the door without surrendering her strength. Orion reappeared at the window upstairs, waving down at them with both arms. Vivian waved back, then glanced at Kyle. "Come on, it's late." And with that, the next chapter of their lives began, not with fireworks, but with 3 words: slow, honest, intentional. The table by the window stayed where it always had, polished wood reflecting the city's glow, framed by glass that held the rhythm of passing nights. Guests still sat there, unaware of the weight of history in its grain. To them, it was simply a good seat with a view. But to those who knew, it had become something else entirely. It was the place where silence once grew heavy when Kyle entered the room, where servers braced themselves for his exacting standards. Now it was also the place where Vivian stood her ground, where kindness answered sharpness, where a man accustomed to command learned the strength of gentleness. The table remained, unchanged in form, but the story around it shifted. Staff spoke of it with quiet reverence. That's where everything turned. Not because of wealth, not because of power, but because of the moment someone chose calm over fear, dignity over deference. Kyle still sat there sometimes, though differently now. His presence no longer chilled the room. Instead, it signaled curiosity. Conversations shared, laughter sparked, the simple act of listening. The table had not moved, but it had been transformed. In this way, it became a quiet monument, proof that places carry memory, and that memory can be rewritten when people choose courage and kindness over control. Stories about Kyle Vaynor still traveled through the city, as they always had, but their shape had changed. Where once the whispers had been warnings, sharp, ruthless, untouchable, they now carried a different note. He listened, he apologized, he changed. In boardrooms, some still doubted him, but others began to notice the results of his shift. Meetings ended earlier, not because he was disengaged, but because he let others speak and trusted their input. His reputation as a relentless driver softened into something rarer, a leader who demanded excellence without stripping people of dignity. Among the restaurant staff, the legend was smaller, more personal. "He thanked me by name," the dishwasher said one night. "Didn't just nod, he looked me in the eye. He asked about my mother," a line cook added, "and remembered the next week." These were not headlines, but they were the kinds of details that built trust. To the public, he was still a billionaire, but to those who worked beside him or served his table, he became something else, a man learning to live without hiding behind arrogance. The frost around his name was melting, not because he had sought redemption for appearance's sake, but because he had started choosing a different kind of strength. And at the heart of it, people began to understand, this wasn't a man softened by weakness. It was a man reshaped by love, respect, and the steady influence of someone who refused to surrender her ground. Their life together did not swell into spectacle. It settled, layer by layer, into something grounded and enduring. Mornings began with Orion's chatter over cereal, Kyle half smiling into his coffee as the boy recounted dreams that leapt between dragons and math quizzes. Vivian braided her son's hair when he asked, listening to his stories with the same patience she brought to every part of her life. Kyle, still learning the art of ordinary, tied Orion's shoelaces once, fumbling at the knots, and was met with laughter that belonged to a family, not a boardroom. Evenings carried their own rituals. Sometimes they cooked together, Vivian showing Kyle how to season without measuring, Orion offering dramatic chef's critiques. Other nights, Kyle arrived late from meetings, but never too late to stop by the small kitchen table, where tea was waiting. No one asked for perfection. Presence was enough. They continued walking home in the rain when it came, the umbrella tilted to cover all three heads. They attended community events at the center, painting signs, playing games, clapping for children's performances. Kyle didn't arrive as a sponsor anymore. He arrived as part of them. Vivienne kept her boundaries clear, and Kyle honored them. She reminded him often, "We are building slowly," and he, once a man who measured progress by speed, found comfort in the deliberate pace. Together they learned that love is not made strong by grand moments, but by steady, intentional choices. Choices to listen, to laugh, to stay when silence is easier, to speak when truth is needed. Choices that over time shaped a life they could all trust. Looking back, the lessons of their journey were not complicated. They were simple truths, lived deeply. True strength was not in Kyle's billions or his power to command rooms. It was in Vivian's steady voice at the table, refusing to give away her peace to arrogance. It was in the way Orion reminded them both that courage could be as small as sharing a drawing. True strength was dignity, standing tall even when whispers circled, refusing to shrink or inflate for anyone's approval. True strength was peace, choosing calm over retaliation, clarity over chaos, boundaries over bending. True strength was humility, the ability to say, "I was wrong," and to let kindness replace control without fearing it meant weakness. And true strength was love, not loud, not rushed, not dramatic, but steady. A hand offered in silence, a walk shared in the rain, a future built not on performance, but on presence. Together, Vivian and Kyle discovered that strength was not about never bending. It was about knowing when to hold firm and when to soften. It was about protecting what mattered and nurturing what grew. And for Orion, watching closely, that lesson became the inheritance he would carry. That courage, kindness, humility, and love were the truest measures of power. And so, the story of Vivian, Orion, and Kyle doesn't end with a grand finale. It continues in the quiet choices of each day. Choices to be steady, to be kind, to stand tall without arrogance, and to love without fear. Now I'd like to turn to you, the listener. Have you ever faced someone whose power or presence seemed overwhelming, yet you discovered that your calm, your dignity, your boundaries were stronger than their storm? What did that moment teach you about yourself? Take a moment to reflect. Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to hear tonight. And if this tale of courage, humility, and love touched you, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Tales by Williams for more stories that uplift and challenge the way we see people. Because in the end, stories like these remind us, true strength is not in fortune or fearlessness. It's in dignity, peace, humility, and love. The kind of strength that changes not only reputations, but lives.